in terms of the big risks facing companies right now, I would say it comes down to simple stability. That may seem kind of like a dud answer, a throwaway answer, but that's really what it is, because right now there's sociopolitical and socioeconomic instability in just about every major market and jurisdiction in the world.
Companies operating in today's global economy really need to get an understanding of the international geopolitical risk landscape. At Infortal Worldwide, we work with our clients on solving risk before it starts. Welcome to the Riskology podcast, where we're looking at managing business risk globally and really understanding the geopolitical risk landscape.
Good afternoon, morning, and night, depending on your time zone. Welcome to Riskology by Infortal. In this podcast, we really talk about how geopolitical risk, intelligence, and business affect your bottom line and the geopolitical risks that you affect in today's global economy. So in this inaugural episode, we really just want to introduce who we are, what we're about, our approach to this podcast, what you'll be hearing, and give you a little bit of information about us individually. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Candice Tal, our CEO.
Thanks, Ian. Very excited to have everyone join us today. As Ian mentioned, we're a global risk management company. We specialize in due diligence investigations and a wide variety of corporate investigations globally. And we are launching a new service offering to do with geopolitical risk. And I have with me Chris Mason, who is our VP of Global Compliance and Investigations, and Dr. Ian Oxnevad, who you just heard from, who's our Director of Geopolitical Risk. And so we're really excited about getting this launched. And Ian gave us a little bit of setting the stage of what we're going to be covering. It's really about the intersection of economics, politics, and business risk on a global stage. Whether you're a small company or a very large company, and you have multinational or international operations anywhere in the world, this is a really great podcast for you to listen in on. And we're going to be addressing both topics as well as regions of the world and a wide variety of different issues that come up that businesses encounter, whether it's sanctions risk exposure, business intelligence issues, corporate espionage, economic espionage, or other types of geopolitical exposures. This is the team that will help you to understand those issues and mitigate them in a real-world context. So before we go any further, what I'd like to do is to have my team introduce themselves, and I'll hand the baton over to Chris and then over to Ian from there.
Appreciate that, Candice, and also great intro, Ian. It's super exciting to be kicking off this podcast series where, as you guys both mentioned, we're going to dive deep into economics, politics, geopolitical risk, and really look at where it all intersects and what businesses can do today to navigate the current landscape. So I think it's going to be really exciting. We've got a never-ending supply of headlines to get through. So I think it's really going to be some interesting stuff that we tackle. Again, before we jump into it, we'll do some brief introductions here. Again, my name is Chris Mason. I'm the VP of Global Compliance and Investigations at Infortal Worldwide. I work very closely with clients and my colleagues here who are joining me to really map out the risk situations that businesses are facing when they're making key investment decisions, whether that's through mergers and acquisitions work, looking at private equity investment, really any big strategic decision. We are able to dissect the risk profile of the situation, dive deep, and really get an understanding for our clients of how to move forward. Before I joined Candice here at Infortal Worldwide, I spent a number of years at a large investment bank where I focused on financial crime and anti-money laundering and money laundering prevention. That's definitely an area that I focused on historically in my career. Before the bank, I was at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, where I spent more than a decade. Ultimately, I was appointed to become the chief economist of what's known as the EB-5 program, which again, we were focused on cash flows and investment coming into the United States. And so that's definitely an area of focus for me, which is something I share with my colleague who I'm about to introduce, Dr. Ian Oxnevad.
Thanks, Chris. So my background's a little different. I didn't come from the corporate world or government. I came from academia. I'm a political scientist and economist by training. I hold a PhD in political science from the University of California. And how I ended up in this sort of business world, even though I still am a practicing scholar, I discovered very early on, somewhat by accident, that this is a whole area that nobody really looks at from a research standpoint or from the practical side, or very rarely. What I noticed, and I got interested in this specifically after my hometown was hit by a terrorist attack in 2015, that issues like terrorist financing, money laundering, corporate espionage, economic intelligence, supply chains, how those interact with geopolitics, all these different things, businesses don't really look at it. So as I started to segue into this research, over time, the practical world sort of pulled me out of the theoretical one. And with that, pulling me out of academia and the university and pulling me into the corporate world. So that's kind of how I ended up here. Before Infortal, I was doing almost exclusively research, but I was also consulting with attorneys as an expert witness on asylum cases, usually related to the Middle East, terrorism, Africa as well, teaching about corruption, terrorist financing, things like that. And then eventually, I kind of branched out and ended up here. So that's enough about me. To kind of frame this podcast a little bit more, it's probably useful to talk about the types of episodes we'll have. And I would say that if you're tuning in, if you're looking at geopolitical podcasts in general, if you're a junkie of geopolitical podcasts, ours is going to be a little different. A lot of those are extremely serious. And of course, while we're talking about a serious subject matter, we're here to keep it fun enough, to keep it light enough and entertaining enough that you can listen to this while you're jogging, while you're on the tube or the subway, depending on what country you're in. Maybe you're on a bus or you're on your way to work, or maybe you're just unwinding at the end of a day. You'll still get something out of it. So with that, to kind of talk about the types of episodes we'll have, I would say they're going to fit into a few broad categories, and this will give you an idea of what to expect. Some days are going to be driven by basically what's happening. If you look at the world around us, we're at the latter part of 2023. We're looking at geopolitical risks unfolding around the world. We have historic levels of inflation. We have supply chain stresses in Europe as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have energy shortages in some cases. We have mounting tensions around China in East Asia. We have new trade agreements and strategic economic developments taking place in the Indian Ocean region, such as the IMEC, or the India, Middle East, European corridor, which will basically be kind of a new trade system that's being established. And we have a number of political risks at the local and regional levels all over the world. And this affects not only the news cycle, but it'll keep things lively. And some of it is going to be in-depth analysis of that using our own sort of analytical take, giving you sort of from our backgrounds, as well as research that we do independently and sources that we may have on the ground. Other episodes are going to be about best practices. Simple questions like, how do you integrate geopolitical risk into your company? If you're an attorney, how do you integrate that into your casework? Or if you're a marketer, are there intelligence tools that you can use to better access your markets? Things like that. You're going to get new ideas on how to improve your bottom line, how to avoid risks before they start, how to exit crises as they emerge. You'll learn things about investigation, intelligence, more specifically open source intelligence, or OSINT. You will be talking about AI developments and how all of these things can help you mitigate risk, whether you're talking about a merger that may go wrong, or board liability, or litigation that's ongoing, or maybe you're just entering a new market. We're going to talk about how to use the tools that are available to the best of your ability. Other episodes, we're going to have guests. We're planning to have a number of guests as we go on, everything from academic backgrounds to authors, historians, to people from the corporate world, people with experience in investing, potentially journalists as well, policy people or former policy people from different countries. So there's going to be kind of a nice mix. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our CEO, Candice.
Thanks, Ian. So I'm Candice Tal, CEO and founder of Infortal Worldwide. We are a global risk management and investigations firm. in business for 38 years. We work in 160 countries globally and always have done. We work for a wide variety of industry sectors and pretty much focus on very large companies, upper middle market to large companies, and as I mentioned, across a wide variety of industries. The areas that we specialize in addition to geopolitical risk, is finding solutions to real-world problems that our clients face. And that could be anything from sanctions risk to FCPA potential violations to finding bad actors, con artists, businesses that are operating with reputational damage and create exposures for the companies that they work with. So that may be your company. You may be representing a large company or have clients that work in a large company, and they have major risk exposures internationally. And that could be through their global supply chains. It could be through executives that they hire, and various types of issues that come up because the information hasn't been checked. There's no detailed evaluation of people's backgrounds, the baggage that companies bring with them to the table, and a whole slew of issues that end up causing risk for the corporation. And where geopolitical risk fits into that is when you're operating on a global stage, you have the micro risk environment, which may be different than micro geopolitics, but nevertheless, immediate risk exposure from the people and businesses that you end up working with, all the way out to country level risks and regional risks. And so as Ian, Chris, and I came together and met each other some time ago, we started to realize that, wow, this is an area that people aren't really talking much about. It tends to be very silent. So a company might approach us and say, hey, we're about to engage this third-party supplier in India or China or historically maybe Russia or Africa, and we just don't know enough about them. So they would ask us to check the people, check the veracity of the information they provide, conduct OSINT investigations or open source intelligence to find out more about them. And other companies would say, you know, we've got a problem here. We've got a major breach of contract issue, or we've got a potential IP theft issue, or somebody is bad-mouthing us in the marketplace. We don't know why, we don't know what they're doing. But hey, you know, we're a medical device company, and it's not good that we've got doctors talking about us online, and we don't know where this information is coming from. Can you help us to figure out where this source of reputation damage may be coming from? And so as we came together to talk about these things, it started to become really obvious that it would go beyond just cross-border work into regional issues, country-level issues, economic issues, political issues. And so we pulled together a series of courses to help educate people on geopolitical risk exposures, business risk exposures that they're facing sort of on the ground today. And so this is setting the stage for a discussion around these kind of topics and what people are really facing out in the world today. And with that, what I'd like to do is to ask Ian and Chris a few questions, have some conversation going, and then see where it takes us. So Chris, I'd love to find out, what are your thoughts about geopolitical risk, and what do you think goes into the equation? What is geopolitical risk really about?
It's a great question. And, you know, something that you mentioned earlier that I think really is a good place to focus for how especially larger companies can think about geopolitical risk. And that's the issue or the challenge of key information getting siloed within organizations. It's really problematic as the risk landscape, as risk management has evolved over the years and become such a large enterprise within massive companies within the United States. It's sometimes hard for all of the right information to come from the risk teams and end up in the right circles within the organization so that the key decision makers can actually act on the information and the intelligence that's there. In the case of geopolitical risk, what we're finding is that information is not making its way to the right individuals within the organizations. Typically, It will be siloed, as you mentioned, within the risk team, maybe even a sub-team within that. And that's where the information stays. And maybe, it's shared with a few groups within the company, but the key decision makers in a lot of cases are not getting the right information. And really, companies are missing out by not being able to understand and examine their geopolitical risk exposures. And that's just talking about potential problems and issues. Once you're able to figure out how to get that information flowing in the right way, then you can really unlock the power of geopolitical risk analysis. And that's really using the information and the intelligence that you can gather to seek out opportunities and really make sure that you're navigating the company down the right path so that you're going to be pretty much placed in a position that's stronger than your competitors if something were to go wrong. So that's sort of how I'm thinking about geopolitical risk at the moment in the context of the corporate setting.
Great. That's really helpful and interesting to think about it from that perspective. And if we take a look at what does the risk stage look like currently today, Ian, maybe you could weigh in on what do you think about current risk exposures globally? Do you have like your top 3 things that you think everybody should know about that's listening in on the podcast? I'm sure we'll get to the top 10 eventually, but what are the key issues today?
Thank you, Candice. I think what's interesting is that if you look at the geopolitical risk landscape today, it can be really summed up as globalization ain't what it used to be. And what that really means is that if there's geopolitical stability and stability within major countries, then the global economy is going to work very well. But because of a number of issues that have happened over the past few years, some of it relates to COVID, some of it relates to just the fact that it's not a unipolar system anymore. And by what that means is that this is not the post-Cold War era in which we had peace and prosperity and the spreading of liberal democracy. If you sum all that up, we're actually going in reverse. You have multiple major powers now. Russia is attempting to basically restore its former greatness in Eastern Europe. You have China that's doing the same thing in the Pacific. India is an up-and-coming power. The EU is trying to be one, and it's questionable whether or not the US is going to be one in this century based on a number of international and domestic factors. Now, what that really means is the economy is going to be leveraged by these different countries to suit their own needs. So the idea that there is a simple one world economy is really not true. You have competing interests as the result of major countries, and that translates into everything from inflationary risks, energy policy, green policy or green energy, net zero emissions goals, looking at human rights issues. Sanctions are going to play into this. And what geopolitical risk is for companies, because that all sounds like great stuff for a news hour. How does that affect a company? Well, it does, but probably in not ways that most people would readily understand. It trickles down to your specific needs. So we've seen, for example, Raytheon and I think Lockheed Martin, they've been sanctioned by China. We've had the offices of Western companies in China that are raided. China now has its own sanctions list. If there's warning signs there for companies to pull out of China, for example, if you're at a company there and you're looking to pull out, well, that gives you a whole set of things to do, a to-do list. So what does that entail? Well, you have to find a new potential supplier. If you're manufacturing in China or you're getting things supplied there, that means that you're either going to have to expand to a different locale. Maybe you're going to be engaging in a merger or acquisition. Maybe you're going to be simply contracting with another supplier, in which case you have to do due diligence. What are you getting into in the sense of this new partnership? What are the legal risks involved? Is your legal team going to actually be able to help you if you wind up in a legal dispute? Or are you going to be stuck in a jurisdiction where law enforcement and executive powers are going to be totally arbitrary? These are questions of politics that most people in business simply do not understand. And I think it's worth mentioning here that in the American case, this is even a bigger issue for American companies because culturally here, we kind of separate out politics from economics. That's not really the case in East Asia or in European countries where they seem to have a better grasp of this. So that's kind of what you're facing. How do you understand these macro risks and how are they going to affect your bottom line, your liability, your profitability, your reputation? And that's really where Infortal comes in. Infortal has a unique ability to address this because we have boots on the ground in multiple countries, and we have an extensive background in open source intelligence. So we can actually give many clients something akin to a full-on intelligence offering without violating any laws. And that's pretty unique. And in terms of the big risks facing companies right now, I would say it comes down to simple stability. That may seem kind of like a dud answer, a throwaway answer, but that's really what it is, because right now there's socio-political and socioeconomic instability in just about every major market and jurisdiction in the world. Energy is almost unaffordable. Here in California, we're at nearly $7 a gallon. You can't run an economy where everything is shipping and moving and transportation. Those costs are going to go up. And that creates political pressures for higher wages, which is a domestic pressure. That there's inflationary pressures related to war. There's monetary expansion. There's supply chain issues because of war related to sanctions, et cetera. There's ramped up FCPA enforcement actions. There's now new standards for mandatory due diligence in Europe as it relates to human rights. Where you do business is actually going to matter. So if you're a company or you're a mid-market company that's trying to grow and thrive in this environment, you're confronting political risks and geopolitical risks right and left that you never encountered before. So with that, I think we're kind of living in unprecedented times. They're not unprecedented, but probably in the living memory of most, it is, because like I said, globalization ain't what it used to be. In a sense, we're kind of reverting back to a kind of a 1920, maybe 1930, or hopefully not 1938 moment, even though depending on where you look at the news, it looks kind of like it. So with that, we're looking at an era that's, you have to look into history for answers to that, but the geopolitical risks are multiple.
Those are great points. You covered such a wide range of topics there, Ian. Fascinating topics. And I know that the audience will be really interested to hear about more of those as we start layering down on different topics and areas. I think there's some really tremendously important information in there. How do companies actually deal with this enormous amount of information that's coming at us today, not only from social media and the media in general, but other aspects of life, work, but in particular in terms of geopolitical risk, because the issues are so huge. You know, we're talking about country risk. And it's one thing to know about country risk in one area, or your own country even, it can be difficult to follow at times. But to pull it all together and make good sense of it in a way that it helps you to not only understand the threats that you might be facing in different parts of the world, but also business risks, on the ground, real world business risks, and then as well business opportunities, because with every threat in the geopolitical sense, there's always an opportunity. Someone's always looking to grow. This war leads to other opportunities, as well as the tragedy of war itself. So I don't want to go down the path of warfare right now, although I know Ian's got a tremendous background in that topic alone. I'm sure we'll talk about that in another upcoming episode. But Chris, a lot of people ask me, what about globalization? Is it over? Are we in the middle of it still? Is it real? Or are we encountering a world that's kind of gradually sort of shrinking and shutting down trading opportunities? What are your thoughts about that?
First of all, is it real? Yes. Is it a phenomenon? Absolutely. Typically, how people have thought about globalization over the past few decades, that setup and that framework of thinking about how the world works and how trade flows throughout the world, that no longer exists. There's been a lot of things that have happened that have really shaken up the key dynamics that have essentially built up what we've thought of as the superpowers of the past, and those relationships are changing. That being said, there isn't a set path forward. It's not guaranteed in one direction or another, depending on how you feel about where globalization is going. But right now, it is a critical moment, and Ian hit on some of that earlier. A lot of the relationships, again, historically, how we've thought about globalization, those have been shaken up. So right now, a lot of different key strategic countries, think India, think Turkey, think some of the companies or countries that are balancing between worlds, they're going to be key players in helping shape what the future is going to look like. And is the US still going to be a major player? Some people say no, but I think we will. I think the US is still extremely strong when you look at the fundamentals, you look at the economy of the United States, you look at how we conduct business. we are definitely, from a US standpoint, going to have a major influence in terms of where things go. It's just a case of how these relationships around the world shape up. And when we think about it in terms of threat versus opportunity, it's a huge moment of opportunity. And that's really what we want to focus on as we move forward, is where are the opportunities here to progress, to move things forward and shape the world in the way that we want to shape it, honestly, at the end of the day. So globalization, the way we've thought about it the past couple of decades, that no longer exists. But from an artist standpoint, there's a blank slate here that we really have in front of us. And that's really exciting.
It is, absolutely. So Chris, please share with us your top thought of global risk outlook as we head into 2024.
Wow, top risk, that one's tough. And I'm going to go here. I know people aren't going to like it, but I'm going with election. And it's not just our election, but elections around the world. I think they're going to be extremely impactful in 2024, particularly economically. If you think about the global landscape and the relationship building, the relationship negotiations that are going on around the world, these elections that are going to transpire in 2024 are going to have a major impact on that. And I think that's really an area to watch. Outside of the back and forth politics here, just think about it from a policy standpoint. I think it's going to be extremely important.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. And we were seeing that across so many different countries today. And some of them, whether it's elections or coups, there's certainly a lot of activity going on politically around the world that is going to upset the economic stage for a lot of different regions of the world. So Ian, I'm going to ask you the same question. What's your favorite top risk for 2024 or end of 2023, whatever you fancy?
Energy, energy, energy. And the reason I say that is because it underpins everything else. You know, you've heard a lot about supply chains over the past few years since COVID and the Ukraine war and sanctions, de-risking, decoupling, and all these ideas related to sanctions and supply chains. But energy underpins all of that. No matter what industry you're in, if you don't have a supply of energy, you don't have an economy. And right now, because of geopolitical risk, because of sanctions related to Russia, because of physical logistical challenges, because of regulations that prevent improvements in the hydrocarbon industry, because of authoritarian risk in places like Iran and Venezuela, because of green policies in Europe and the US, and an increasing appetite for oil in China, energy worldwide is not only in flux, but unstable for a lot of industries and in a lot of locales. It's a question of whether or not consumers, investors, and enterprises of different sizes are going to be able to access energy at an affordable price, because it doesn't really matter where the energy comes from. If it's too expensive, it really doesn't matter. And because of the geopolitical risks that are taking place, but also domestically, that's a big thing that doesn't seem to have a solid answer right now. And right now, I think that's probably the biggest risk facing everybody, geopolitically as well as domestically, is energy.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ian. Thanks, Chris. So energy and elections, our favorite topics going forward into 2024. It'll be really interesting to see where this all stands in the next few months and what's changed and what's new on the scene. So thanks again for tuning in, and remember to send in any comments or questions that you might have or topics that you'd like us to address. We've got a range of topics coming up, which we'll hopefully be able to post in our comments. And we look forward to seeing you in the next podcast. Bye for now.